Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval archery, specifically making an overview about the arms ratio, right, strength ratio fundamentally, but also what we can get in terms of cultural differences across Eurasia and also in the way different social estates would consider these weapons. We talk about bows, but also crossbows, so in general any not properly missile warfare, just archery as such. However, framing it still within the broader, understanding that I think today has prevailed, unfortunately, because it's incorrect, right, regarding the alleged kind of decisiveness of missile warfare towards the end of the Middle Ages. Naturally, any medieval warfare expert knows what we're talking about, how also historiographically and or just in a popular sense the concept of the arrow managing to take down the knight has been somehow overly emphasized, committing an enormous as elementary mistake as far as properly even just the order of the hierarchy of the various arms is concerned. Classically speaking, in fact, not even pre-gunpowder era, because fundamentally firearms took half of a millennium before becoming decisive, or at least the most important arm on the battlefield. And generally speaking, the impression is because of this kind of modernistic sense that somehow during the Renaissance, things changed for kind of a greater development, kind of a great increase of kind of individual freedom and all this BS that never happened, because the Renaissance is the greatest affirmation of the Ancien regime, the rigid crystallization of political and social hierarchy, and the prevalence still of the nobility that would not be, let's say, the prevalence necessarily of the older men-at-arms per se on the battlefield, but that fundamentally did retain a place of honor for a long time, and also, let's say, after the alleged kind of even a reinforcement before the alleged beginning of the end, right, in the early 14th century, where people fundamentally think there is kind of a linear improvement of infantry just per se, so the concept of the military revolution and so on, while actually it was a bit more of an up and down, kind of bumpy road kind of pattern that was never about, even of course, just infantry per se against cavalry per se, even in those battles where you have just maybe infantry at some point. Think about Courtrai and other, actually many battles of the early 14th century that, however, fundamentally ended as such, right, and wouldn't be able to create any military system or durable doctrine or whatever that could essentially face successfully cavalry until the very end of the Middle Ages, right? And when the Renaissance warfare properly kicks in as such, and when still it's a matter of combined arms, as it had always been, of course, also before, so but never about the single arm just per se. I made multiple videos about this topic, from, say, this debunking mostly the idea of the military revolution, that in fact nobody really believes in anymore, but that has left an incredibly long and hideous legacy in historiography, for which people, yes, criticize it, but they still reason throughout that pattern, right? As if, by the way, we should just follow any kind of, postmodern study that at some point decides to make a bit of fireworks with terminology, and we should be using as a paradigm as opposed to actual history and actual sources. That is something that I definitely prefer. I made last autumn a video about it's titled "Riding into Hell." It's two videos actually about the same topic. So on the constant awareness of infantry potential from the side of the nobility. Other thing that is usually used to instead to be denied to justify the defeats, especially of French cavalry. That again was not just cavalry during the 100 Years' War. That in fact as such never occurred, right? The 100 Years' War were actually much more symmetric battles than what we're usually thought to believe. Last autumn, in fact, I also made a video about the Battle of Poitiers, that in 1356, of course, that is quite revealing there, because you understand that the English kicked ass, but there is hardly any indicator of any relevance of the longbow as a cause of that victory, as much as it could be seen when we will do it better for Crécy or Azincourt. Now, this concept, we'll try to explain also why it's so deeply ingrained and why we have, of course, both in this technologism. This is going probably to be a long video, but we're not scared. We also talked about communal warfare, right? There is a lot about, naturally, the communal infantry's development that, frankly, has yet to be studied historiographically. Like, again, people mostly fixated with the early 14th century, just because you have armies that fundamentally, say, infantry-only armies that managed to defeat tactically complete armies, right? We're often talking about small armies, right? It was not a huge deal. It was not like, again, the beginning of an infantry revolution or the affirmation of any military system, the same infantrymen of Flanders that had crushed the French cavalry at Courtrai would be miserably defeated repeatedly throughout all their history until basically the mediocre result of Guinnegat throughout all the 14th and 15th century by Franco-Burgundian armies that were still cavalry-based. So we have been properly flashed by this kind of, again, myth of the thing, and even when you actually study the real sources about from the closest, let's say, to these events, you realize that they weren't reading those battles in the way we eventually began to fantasize on in later times, for whichever reason, very often a nationalistic one and not an actually traditional one that would have brought us in a much more civilizationally advanced situation than the one we are now. There is a lot of socialism for that matter as well, because this whole idea that there was, you must not study military history unless it's something useful for social understanding. It's bullshit, right? Military history is a discipline on its own, even more specifically the art of war, and we study it for itself, right? It's connected with all the rest, but creating a hierarchy, right, of values in this regard, as if the material side of the story was more important than the spiritual one, is just an asinine mistake. And I remind that the Clausewitzian Trinity is a real trinity: politics first of all, then war, and then society, all together, right? So it doesn't even it's just a structuralistic presumption and mistake, of course, to pretend to separate gnostically such elements. We have talked about communal infantries in this regard because I think that, especially in the case of the Italian ones, you have the perfect example of how infantry should never be considered, at least in this time, as the sole arm. As if there was anything kind of advanced or futuristic about having sole infantry armies. Very often in the Middle Ages, if you had only infantry armies, it's because you were a backwardly underdeveloped fringe community that was just exploiting a kind of a autonomistic decentralization, as opposed to having any kind of integrated military force, right? So actually, when you look at the largest forces ever employed of infantry in the Middle Ages, you realize that they were in places where infantry never actually defeated cavalry because it didn't have any political interest in doing so, right? Some of the largest battles in the Middle Ages was the Battle of Montecatini that the Cambridge medieval warfare doesn't even remember, as opposed to even smaller ones like Alto Pascio, still in an Italian context 10 years later, which gives you properly the dimension of the magnitudinal scale of failure that historiography up to this point has properly achieved, right? And not just because of the size of the infantry, but of the dramatically advanced interaction of that infantry. We're talking about missile fire, stopping power, pikemen, tens of thousands of pikemen. Not even the Swiss armies at the end of the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance would actually achieve such numbers in such a systematic, regular way as was happening at the peak of the great medieval civilization between the 13th and the 14th century before the crisis. And naturally, communal warfare is exactly for this, not just infantry warfare. It's a fully integrated cavalry, infantry, and missile kind of. I add missile because somehow, and I explained this in that video critique to, what's that guy's name? I don't remember, but he makes videos about medieval warfare. He's pretty famous. And that's still, and this is what we will further keep debunking today, put at the center the idea that missile warfare was somehow an equal to, say, heavy infantry or heavy cavalry. This is just per se another indicator of radical strategic illiteracy. Missile arms wouldn't become decisive until the 18th century, right? So to talk about medieval warfare in terms, you have essentially, the missile weapons managing to stop cavalry or this other garbage is just offensive, not just to the dignity of human intelligence, of course, but also to the massive and extensive historiography that exists on this topic today, at least has gotten these things fairly right, and from quite a long time. This is the problem, right? That, of course, I could make the easy criticism of kind of the Anglosphere in the sense that the longbow is perhaps the only reason in the history of historiography, and in fact on the way this would interpret, because of specific reasons, that these arms create such a wild misconception about what actually archers do on a battlefield and what is their relevance, as a matter of fact. In any case, it's self-evident, and so I actually have grown with Anglo-Saxon historiography, so especially as far as medieval warfare is concerned, so I'm actually very thankful for it in the first place. What always naturally bothers me the most is how people, passively or blindly assume certain kind of, bias that can exist in historiography, even with some degree of scientific value, but just to, again, make up whatever they want with it and pretend that, for some reason, right, this type of warrior, this weapon, this tactic must have been such a big deal. How many times on YouTube you've seen this kind of hysterical kids talking about shield walls as if they had ever been even an offensive tactic or anything special or something complicated. Any single infantry in the history of mankind that had shields used shield walls essentially in a defensive fashion. Every single damn one. There is not a tactics associated to that. Even the ones like the pig snout formation would have practically nothing to do with that, but still, people are fixated essentially because they have a cinematographic, aestheticistic kind of fantasy based on literally no trace of any military historical evidence that they want to push forward because they are essentially phrenastanic and they can't essentially keep their mouth shut when they should be doing so, preferably for themselves. The we live largely in a world like this. We live largely in a world where even adults don't want to be challenged anymore. They don't want to, to pretend to even think that they may be wrong in something, because essentially they have grown weaker in so many ways. And great part of our job in the future historians is essentially to correct properly mostly the mental disorders rather than the historical ignorance of people, which naturally is something that, of course, as historians hopefully will not do. But if you followed me from some time at this point, you have realized what fundamentally my channel gets down to in terms of method and kind of moral and scientific approach to this topic, right? So at least it is clear to most people that cavalry survived for a long time on the battlefields, always with its unmitigated function, right? It's only towards the end of the 19th century that with rifled barrels and semi-automatic or automatic machine guns, that cavalry literally lost a substantially relevant role, right? At least in most operations. Naturally, during World War I, you still see, especially at the beginning, at the end of it, with more movement warfare, still a great importance of cavalry. Cavalry still exists. There are many military theaters in the world where it could and does actually serve its purpose. Still, we're not making a history of that. The important is to understand in this regard that in the Middle Ages there was actually no real military collapse of cavalry, right? By any stretch of the imagination. Cavalry could be resized, right, redimensioned, actually also diversified, because cavalry towards the end of the Middle Ages became ever more specialized in a sense. So it wasn't just the shock force it could simply punch, right? As it had been since during the Middle Ages and before, mostly even in times when, of course, infantry was decisive over the same cavalry that objectively hadn't enjoyed even this dramatic and kind of unchallenged domination of the battlefield for, if not for just like a couple hundred years, right, in the full Middle Ages, right? If you look at, of course, from early medieval times, you realize that cavalry increased consistently its importance. It becomes more important than infantry, but it doesn't become decisive per se, nor infantry just alone was about that, if you consider it at least in its missile element and just in its heavy component. And it's just essentially from the mid-12th century that you can objectively say, yes, that cavalry is decisive. And even though it works in combined arms naturally with infantry, fundamentally is unchallenged until, it's always challenged. There are infantries that withstand its attack, but that do not succeed alone, right? And so that's why we remember Courtrai and this kind of string of roughly 20 infantry victories until the mid-14th century that were, however, just like a tail strike of, again, popular kind of rural, communal, whatever, decentralized communities at the end of the Middle Ages, and not even in the most advanced areas of Europe, militarily speaking. So, and it, again, in fact, would not have a future in that sense. Actually remained some of the most backward places in Europe on the long run still, right? So that should also be understood. I made many videos at this point also about kind of infantry warfare during the Middle Ages, so you can catch some reference here and there, but we will talk about the protagonists of those victories, because part of the intrinsic strength of infantry there has been kind of also overstated. Like, an infantry victory is not always the same thing. It's not practically even ever just an infantry withstanding, like in full open field, like cavalry charge directly, there is always a strong position, there are always ditches, there is always, and naturally you have to understand there also the numerical ratios, the motivations, and always realizing that even when cavalry failed in the great, for example, French defeats of the 14th or the early 15th century, they were never actually doing something dumb, right? They actually went always pretty darn close to crushing the enemy, and they used essentially the best tactic possible to achieve that, right? And almost succeeding, and eventually keeping to succeed. And this is not just to be measured on the battlefield, right? Because, as we've seen, war is just a continuation of politics with other means, and the second half of the 14th century, for example, is the moment of the most brutal systemic repression of all this kind of rebel infantries that had tried to take a place in the political and institutional establishment of Europe, and that instead miserably failed and fundamentally didn't rise until the 18th, the 19th century again, right? So talking about this kind of infantry premise is always very complicated when, again, you have been raised being told that, from the 16th century to the modern age, new ideas, people were freer, there was the end of the terrible church and all this thing. No, right? It did not happen like that, and even those infantrymen that took over the battlefields in the Renaissance were not free people. They were essentially proletarian mercenaries paid, equipped, and trained by the most powerful dynasties of Europe, and they would remain that for a very long time. And arguably, just the dynasties were substituted by the state at one point, and fortunately we've never had in the history of mankind a polity that was ever ruled by the people, because of course it would be an unmitigated disaster in the first place, as it did happen when they tried, which also makes you see the military accomplishments of the nobility in the early modern age in a much more interesting fashion, because these were the people that did maintain fundamentally an aristocratic, chivalric lifestyle. We've made videos as far as Prince Eugene and the Great Turkish Wars, and still, full 18th century crusades, nobility, knighthood. It's the same thing, right? From the Ancien Regime in the Middle Ages, this stuff, in a way, continued until, again, 1918 to the latest. It shows how, how thoroughly successful the what we call improperly the military revolution. It was not a revolution, but let's say at least the shift from the decisiveness of cavalry to the one of infantry, as in fact an accomplishment of the same nobility and not of any kind of emergence of the people as such, right? And again, I think this is one of the single most important topics on which people fundamentally stumble on, right? And without any minimal suspicion of awareness that things could have been gone otherwise. However, today we talk specifically about about archery, as we've seen before. So not just the longbow, but also the simple bow, crossbow, right? And it's important to observe here yet another divide. That is the one existing between the Western world and the rest of Eurasia. And the way, in fact, Western culture, since the time of the Hellenic hoplites and the Roman legionaries, so militarily speaking, as a culture, the impact of masses had coped, right, with the bow, right? That in this sense we still have, and I often talk this like a bit through a sort of Vietnam syndrome, etc., the impression that was always a terrible thing, that always created dramatic problems to the Westerners that could not somehow cope with the the hit-and-run tactics, feint flights, guerrilla attrition, and whatever. So this idea, for example, of the Parthian shot, this terrible thing. What's about the Parthian shot, right? Missile arms at this point in history are not decisive, right? The Parthian shot is just, of course, an expression of the top equestrian cultures of the time. It's the ability of these fierce Middle Eastern, Iranian horsemen to still shoot arrows on horseback in any kind of direction at any given moment, being always kind of bitingly dangerous, even during a retreat and whatever. But this is a Parthian shot. When you look at a battlefield, what you see is lots of Parthian shots indeed, but also in fact, self-evidence that all those Parthian shots by themselves are never decisive against any heavy element, including the ones of the same, say, Parthian armies, right? When you think about Karai, what's the deal there? That the Parthians had lots of arrows. Now, the deal there is that the Parthians had managed to ambush the Roman cavalry, the Gallic cavalry, that had preceded ahead of the legions, who were essentially entering in a well-orchestrated ambush, and that thus saw the heavy element, shock element of the cataphract horses, supported by the light element of the horse archers, carrying out a very well-oiled and effective, and in that case successful, combined armed tactics against sole heavy infantry, as the Roman legions practically were, that was pinned down, worn out continuously, cut out from most of their supplies, right, in a terrible environment, and that began, in fact, to melt away and brought to the disaster of Karai. Does this have to do with missile warfare per se? No, it has to do with combined arms, the same combined arms that tactics that the Romans operated in their cases with heavy cavalry, heavy infantry, and other, of course, elements that they integrated in, also a more effective military system. I made a video actually about Julian's Mesopotamian campaign 400 years later, in which we, of course, assessed, just like throughout Roman military history, that I don't know if you ever noticed, but the Romans marched multiple times on the Persian capital, and most of the Persian strategies there revolved around essentially giving ground to the Romans, hoping just to lure them in an ambush. From the von Clausewitz series, we have seen how if you have a military superiority, you don't want, because it's counter productive to waste time luring the enemy in an ambush. If you just have that superiority to simply walk over him and crush him in achieving a much greater victory. We've seen also in the video about Antony's, in fact, Parthian expedition, where that is one of the best examples of how basically the Romans lost because they failed in their objectives, but they weren't practically destroyed by the Parthians that continued this kind of constant skirmishing guerrilla tactics without ever, however, daring to crash into the Roman legions directly, because they knew that they would have had the worst hand there and just hoped to wear them out to achieve to gap that asymmetry that derived from the fact that they were the inferior enemy. And this can be observed as a Western-Eastern dichotomy to approximate throughout all history. We have seen many Crusader battles in which that is practically the case. I even made a video that Western tactics were superior to the ones of, say, of the Seljuks. More often than not, we've seen how also the myth of the Western kind of heaviness, right, and thus alleged lack of agility is is not true, right? From both the Crusader mounts to the Reconquista horses, we've seen that even a heavy knight could chase an Eastern horse archers, just even in a different way. We were talking about the other day about Iberian cavalry in the ancient world against the Numidian one. It was by, at least in the West, by par excellence, the skirmishing one that were credited being able simply to chase a Numidian horseman and taking him down in the first place. And that is a very important assessment, because it's obvious that in that sense the West is able to make greater effort. So if you pick the warrior individually, there is no doubt that it's superior. Even the same tactics in that regard appear to be superior collectively. The Vietnam syndrome mostly stemming from the concept that still this requires a great cost, that politically it may have not been worth pursuing, and that's the reason why, while the Westerners were superior tactically to the Muslims, for example, in as far as the Levant, the Near Eastern Crusades of Outremer, they eventually lost. They eventually bailed out, right? Because politics, not military. And this aspect is yet another topic that is not adequately recognized in the popular understanding of the history of warfare. So it seems prominently to me still nowadays. And this is not, by the way, to say that here we're just making a military analysis, right? If we were to make a political analysis, there is no doubt that in those conditions, the other side won. The point even there is by which extent. Well, definitely not the one of significantly crippling Western civilization or preventing it to take over the world in the following century. So every war is fought on a space that creates its own conditions, that brings again the political will to take an action rather than another. And so we have always to be cautious, just like saying, I don't know why the Romans didn't conquer Scotland, right? You understand that Rome had all the military potential to simply permanently occupy a place like Caledonia, but they simply chose not to, right? Which is a very different thing from just saying, that there is an absolute superiority or quality or whatever. And the same concept is the one I was making the case for before, of the victory of the early 14th century communes and rustics against cavalry with sole infantry armies that, however, came in some actually the most underdeveloped areas of Europe, right? You can't pick Frisia or the Dithmarschen as an area that was developing who knows what kind of military sophistication. You can appreciate the bravery, the determination, the resilience of these people. But hardly you can make the claim that these were harbors of kind of greater, civilizational developments on the longer run. So that naturally derives from in that case, for example, the political conditions of the empire. But the same is true for, pick the Scottish infantries, right? They were extremely primitive and brutal and unsophisticated. But in that case, they succeeded in many ways. The same goes for the Swiss. The Swiss were not by any degree, any kind of top armies by the early 14th centuries. They would become in the mid-15th, but even in there with a degree of kind of development that is often just considered in absolute terms, while it should be appreciated in relative terms, because that's also how much is needed to succeed, right? You don't need to be the absolute best. In warfare, what works more often than not is just the good enough, right? And you have to understand why in that case, politically, before militarily, that was good enough, right? So there is another question about this, that is to say, the medieval knight, seemingly, through chivalric literature and ethos and so on, seemed to have obstanced a deep contempt towards bows and arrows, right? Because they were considered vile weapons, as they were appositely created to avoid what was considered the loyal direct clash, right? Because they struck from the distance, they were often associated to feint flight maneuvers, according to the famous step tactics, but not only. By the way, always consider that when we talk about feint flights, we are often indicating from a strictly military point of view, as they happen, actual retreats, right? So the capacity of breaking is regrouping is important, but as I was saying before, this does not happen if you have the possibility of remaining cohesive, right? Which is something that you will decide to abandon to great detriment and risk only if you are under a superior pressure for which you have to give way, right? Now, there is a huge problem that I dealt with only partially, I remember, in my master thesis back in the day, regarding the debunkment of this kind of chivalric literature that was very ideal, right, of course, in intent, right? It was naturally highlighting some important beliefs shared, morally speaking, among knights, among the nobility, right? But that, of course, did not correspond necessarily to reality, right? Now, I should open a huge parenthesis that I will try to avoid, but make the long story short, what we see is that when the same knights, actually the few times, right, because some of these were just songs, were from the older epos, of course they were filled with lots of details and insight that were, in fact, also stemming from a military experience, but generally speaking, you realize that just the canon of such literature was based on models that had nothing to do with actual warfare, right? They weren't actually describing what happened on the battlefield. And there are only rare instances in which you have knights that, first of all, write about, actually, compose the stuff, which was frequent, right? Actually, the Minas Anger often, came from a knightly background, as you know. But they still fundamentally stuck to a literary model that didn't care about what was happening on the battlefield. First of all, because these men just knew it, right? They didn't have to explain it to anyone. People knew generally, right, from the peasant to the nobleman to the merchant, what war was concretely about, right? So nobody needed to describe this up to a certain point in history to a satisfactory level for us to reconstruct it, which is one of the first things you have to understand whenever you read a medieval source, right? Even, fencing treatises that start existing from the 14th century, it doesn't, they are, of course, realized to document that kind of dimension, but they're not supposed to be composed exactly to give you an objective, reliable, mechanical, technical idea of what, say, dueling really was, even less what actual warfare really was. Yet again, you find lots of people today that think that that's, just like the Bible, and of course, the obvious consequence is that they all have different ideas on how to interpret this works, because normally also the communities that do this are not qualified even to read any medieval source for that matter, are even properly strategically educated. But they tend to attribute to this like a value of truth, right? The few times in which you have knights, men-at-arms that describe war, aside from the canons, that can be really pervasive, and are most of the times, you realize that kind of less loyal tactics were pretty much out there, that there was a moral question about them, but after all, everybody used them, and so it was just a matter of, even within this broad military systems, who would employ them technically, right? Where did this aversion towards bow and arrow stem from? Well, it stemmed from the obvious realization that, first of all, those who use missile weapons are weaker than those who go there, fighting hand to hand. For the simple matter that in order to do the latter thing, you have to be simply better equipped, better armed, better trained, in general, a nobleman, somebody that can afford that continuous training, that equipment, whatever, and that is designed exactly to close in, to attack directly the enemy into hand-to-hand combat. And those who use missile weapons, generally speaking, are just people who were not properly even conceived to ever get in such an engagement, because again, they're weaker and they're just trying to wear you out in some ways, and even to cause you losses on a bigger scale, but not to actually succeed in that. So if you use those weapons, you're automatically of a lower extraction. This has nothing to do with the fact, though, that, of course, a crossbow could have easily been the side weapon of any knight in these contexts. We know that. We know that from many sources that, of course, first of all, knights were trained to use any single kind of weapon. The fact that in high medieval times, cavalry would specialize in Western Europe, mostly in this kind of thickly packed shock charge, kind of couche length charge, doesn't mean that these knights, as they were, instead wouldn't be employed in other operations. That would require, again, any kind of weapon, because knights fought literally everywhere, right? Including as skirmishers, including as, think about, even still at the time of Hastings, the fact that most Norman cavalrymen didn't fight even yet with stirrups, but that kind of default, thickly packed shock charge formation tactic that was already there, but that they would sometimes kind of mitigate to, say, run in front of the enemy and throwing a D-lance against the enemy formation to soften it up before charging it. Of course, meaning that by this point, infantry was still very substantial and they needed to soften it up before charging into it. And this problem naturally would continue over time, except, as we were saying before, between essentially the 12th, the 13th century, cavalry would just mostly attack frontally, and mostly other cavalry, because infantry was just not even properly supposed to be able to withstand a cavalry charge, with notable exceptions. And that, again, were, before the 14th century, not decisive, not successful. You had infantry men that could resist. The most famous examples are the ones from the Lombard League, again, for entire days against the imperial heavy cavalry. At that point was at the peak of its kind of technical, moral, cultural superiority, and that, however, always required, in fact, other cavalry to get the job done if they would succeed in the first place, right? So this hatred towards whoever was less than the heavy fighter was, of course, justified by the fact that when you're at war, you're literally going there to kill people, right? And these people want to kill you, and if they're incapable of doing that, of course, going to vent the hatred against these cowards that shoot from the distance, because they cannot afford to be better to face you directly, because they are too weak, and they are too weak in that sense, not because they made a choice, they rolled the dice and chose what kind of RPG player category they had to spawn on the battlefield, but because they were literally the lesser people. They were peasants, they were people that were not developed as much as a knight, that were ignorant, that were poor, that didn't know better than that. And this obviously always recognizing that wasn't anything like a class fight, in the sense that, first of all, this order of society and politics was deeply ingrained, right? A peasant perfectly know what the hierarchy was about, and he may have not liked that very much, but it was somehow obvious in the bigger picture that there was, in fact, a reason why they were under, and that also was manifested on the battlefield. But knights fought supported by those same elements, squires, infantry, and so on. So, and that had always been the case, because these were all clientelar society, and so they formed, in fact, a societas, or universitas, as it was known in Latin at the time. And the entire universe was conceived with that internal order. It was eminently functional, because on the battlefield they all worked together also pretty efficiently, and of course also the infantry weapons were actually pretty darn dangerous. And now we will talk about this specific aspect, and they did help, there is no doubt, right? I would like just to make an excursus, however, towards the Eastern mindset, because the, let's say, archery culture, let's put it in this way, can boast a very different tradition from the Western one. Not only here in the Middle Ages, we're talking generally about the Islamic world, but also more broadly in the Persian, Indian, Altaic, Chinese, and Japanese culture. Throughout the millennia, right? For example, in Vedic mythology that we have also discussed recently, the bow is the heroic weapon par excellence, right? Among the Persians, and the same Greeks, actually, archery, besides training for war and hunting, also had a precise initiatic value. Just think, for example, of the divine archer Apollo and the Homeric episode in the Odyssey of Ulysses' bow, as drawing this weapon is not a proof just of, a certain physicality and of ability, but rather of precisely royal legitimacy. Right? We could digress on this, because naturally, the way in the European mythology and epos, expresses itself varies, in fact, from place to place, and you have Indo-Europeans that are just, in the steppes as essentially nomads, and others that have already sedentarized and fight just mostly with infantry, as heavy infantry is their, of course, decisive arm. And you can definitely see, even these are a couple of Hellenic examples that were heavily influenced by a degree, also by some kind of simply closer Eastern reality, from the Iranian world to the in fact, they are commanded later, well, in Homeric times, we're still before that, but I mean a Middle Eastern influence, where that archery was in fact much more present than in the West, right? So even the later kind of say refinements of these legions, when they were written down, etc., do have a lot to do with, say, how much the Pelasgian culture, for example, influenced even the weapons choice as opposed to the origins. And the origins, however, did contain it too, as the horse archery of the steppe had been quite a thing there. So the idea, as we will see now, is that, of course, weapons per se are not the crucial aspect only. Swords were very important as fundamentals in these other cultures, but generally speaking, the East does confer greater importance to archery than the West. The bow in Zen school and Bushido culture is quite notoriously crucial. Probably the memory of the bow as symbol and instrument of, for example, the Mongolian imperial conception is still remembered in one of Mao Zedong's poems, right? That draw heavily from universal literature, in spite of the disgustingly communistic outcome of the Chinese world, talking specifically about, quote, Genghis Khan the adored son of heaven that knew how to draw his bow towards the golden eagles. And that's the saying, golden eagle of Rome, right? And the single most central Indo-European concept, actually. And evidently not only, right? Because the Mongols were not Indo-Europeans, but they had the same universal belief. And again, tradition does go far beyond even that kind of divide, right? At that point, it's just a matter of saying, how does, however, the presence of archery affect that same idea of heroic kind of struggle and transfigurational, dimension? Because, of course, there is, from one side, the idea that even with the single power of thought, of knowledge, pick Apollo and Athena, you can win over your enemies. But how much the fact that Western Eurasia remained fundamentally much more kind of heavily armored, kind of knightly based, as opposed to the east, where, in spite of the heavy element, however, there was a much greater presence of archery, right? And how did this affect the local literature, and how much you can argue that necessity of being properly not just a guy that draws a bow, but something much more dynamic, like, in fact, a swordman, in a mental and physical sense, would affect, right? This could explain some. Tradition says that all the great civilization actually comes from the West, right? It's not really known. It's part of the same myth of Atlantis by a degree. And you can argue that even the same China may have had, imperially speaking, in the very origins, some Indo-European, origin itself, right? Think about just the era from which chariot warfare spread and all the symbology connected to that. And so that also the conception of the heavier fighter remained somehow at the base of also Western civilization in its expansional phase and world domination, even over these Eastern cultures that to this day have all become Western. So even whether they like it or not. So the thing may take different, of course, characters, because you can argue that also there is a different degree. It's not just by saying, well, okay, but according to tradition, even just a minimal effort technologically is actually technology itself, as from the myth of Prometheus, would be a consequence of the fall, not just of mankind, but also of the gods themselves. So if the more you're loaded and kind of the more technologically served you are, well, yes, but there is also another degree, meaning that what can you do with that, right? And what can you actually achieve with that? Because it's obvious that, for example, the peak of feudal culture, as we see in the West, it was present in other Asian cultures as well, but it was more compactly homogeneous, and that also requires an incredible individual effort that, in this sense, the horse archer can do, because it's also extenuating to fight that way, but that can achieve less just per se. So I'm just going by stereotypes, and I always remind you that, of course, in all these cultures there was a heavy element. The importance, again, is how heavy was that compared to the others as well, and why, right? In order to answer these questions and how to connect them with tradition, we should make many other videos, but I think I gave you the insight there already. In any case, there is as we've seen also in the Veda, a very important symbol behind the bow as a royal and thus imperial and divine weapon. That is to say, the archetypal association with the bridge. I mean, the bow, just like the bridge, is a connection between heaven and earth, right? So an instrument of communication between different cosmic areas, that between God and man, right? And so the perfection of a shot, right, could embody that. Is kind of a continuous focus on the chances that you're going to take in order to achieve what is achievable, but that requires a dramatic a dramatic effort, and in this sense, what does achieve more, a bow or let's say, a heavy fighter, right? So that is again to be answered also in the measure on how many people actually work for the heavy fighter as opposed to the bowman just per se, because being trained as a bowman costs much less than being trained just as a swordsman, and even more like a shock heavy cavalryman, right? Which normally does not, in fact, even though he knows how to use a bow, and as we've seen, this was the case of Western knights as well, perfectly well, still would prefer to fight in a more effective way for what they could afford with that panoply, with that training, with their assets, and so on. And in fact, this is the point, coming back to the West, that our bow was not a secondary weapon because, there's some kind of strange cultural difference, but for the simple fact that the bow is always a secondary weapon for everyone, and secondly, Europeans always had this kind of heavier force that was not possible to eliminate just with missile warfare. That, again, would have not been able to do it anyway, because wherever in the world there was always a heavy element, right? But this heavy element in the West was heavier than in the rest of the world. It is the same reason why the steppes peoples never de facto took over the West, right? They surely entered it. They surely left their trace. They surely actually revived the same traditional ideology, but Europe was a civilization, like the sedentary Middle East, like sedentary China, like sedentary India. The steppes remained a marginal area, right? So that had enormous warlikeness, but just as a consequence of the lack of other resources locally, right? Now, as I just explained, there is also a further step. How successfully are you going to use those resources, though, for further expansion, right? So in the West, the bow had played always actually a more important role than, in fact, what we are prone to believe. It surely had never just stayed a hunting weapon, for example, also because, the same thing you can do to an animal can do to a human being. There wasn't even there is objectively not much of a difference. It is true that the bow was associated mostly to the poorer elements of society. I mean, just look at it, and not just the bow, but any kind of the javelin, whatever, any missile weapon in all the the Hellenic world, the Roman world, the Celtic world, the Germanic world. You always have the sense that while this weapon is present and it recurs and is insidious, right? In the Iliad, the top killing weapon in relative terms is the bow, which is probably an exaggeration because otherwise, if it had been so easy to use, would have been, so effective, would have simply supplanted the kind of the heavy infantry just per se. So that obviously talks of the unfairness of the, say, in the missile troop exploitational capacity of the hero's weakness, right? In the Germanic epos, you always have this doom looming over the hero that at some point did something wrong. So it's not perfection; it's a sin. He has lost basically the chance of transfiguring, and he dies in kind of ignominious way. Look at Siegfried. That is, okay, he's not killed by a missile weapon. It's still something cowardly, right? While he is without armor, turned, right? This is the typical thing. When he is demasculated, it's just like the assassination of Albo, in which his sword is tied to the bed, and while he's massacred, betrayed by his wife and her lover. So there is always this sense of, look, that if you lower the guard, you sin to the point that somebody inferior to you can take over you, right? And you see in the for example, throughout the entire Middle Ages. I mean, the lower classes of recruitment of medieval armies were the peasantry that had just to, as the sources say, go at war with a quiver, right, with a bow, with this kind of minimal standard equipment. And definitely the European peasantry in the early medieval times, in the kind of desolated, forested areas, whatever, had always kind of course, practiced this kind of poor hunt, right, with a bow, with a self-bow, that, by the way, in the West is built exactly in the same identical way since prehistory. We don't have the composite bow, if not on the eastern outskirts of the continent, and then in some times of, say, the Romans, say, any military that had the capacity of implementing it on kind of a large scale could bring it further west. The Byzantines had composite bows. Of course, also the Sarmatian auxiliaries that were settled as far as Britain did have, in fact, composite bows, but this did not alter just the European standard self-bow, which in fact also in the longer exemplars called longbows is completely identical to any other kind of bow, right? I always stress this. The longbow is not a technological achievement. It's just what existed since prehistory as just a larger bow than the average, because the guy who used it was larger than the average. Right, now we'll see how doctrinally this was, say, even though in anachronistic terms it became kind of a specialty in late medieval times, but there is nothing, like longbows were used all over Europe, everywhere, by every people. There is nothing specific about that. There is nothing special about that. There is nothing glamorous about that, because technology alone is totally worthless. The only thing that matters is doctrine, right? And technology alone is nothing. If you don't know how to operate a gun, you have the technology, you don't know what it is and how to use it, and you may not have the political, social capacities to do, for example, what the English did during the 100 Years' War with these bows that they began to select just in terms of power, as for the larger guys that had also to train in kind of an athletic way in order to be proficient. For what? For achieving a specific result on the battlefield. That also was something more gradual, less teleological to develop than we usually think. Just as contingential, very often the same tactics of the 100 Years' War really were. And I explained it countless times. There is no doubt that the English armies of the 100 Years' War, if you pick in terms of, in conditions of symmetry, let's say France and England were the same thing, right? Culturally, technologically, materially, or the same thing. And indeed, in terms of number and repeated outcomes in the battles, the single most successful army in history. Yet this had barely anything to do with the longbow. They could have done the same thing with a crossbow. There are reasons why they chose that as opposed to others, but also it was quite interchangeable with. It was not, for example, a longbow crossbow competition, as many people think it actually was. It had nothing to do with that. It had, again, to do with mostly what we get from the sources, with how, with leadership, with morale, yes, but chiefly also down to the tactical details, how you alternate, what position you take, of course, what ground you hold, with the attacker, with the defender, and how they cope with that, because if you're the defender, you're the weaker side normally, and that also we should remember, and how you alternate the various battle lines, how much you bet that, 3 is better than 2, and whether you have the capacity to carry out a flank attack in the meanwhile, whatever, all things that you cannot, you can pre-plan if you have enough time in such terrible situations, but that you, even if you had the means of, you cannot know whether they will succeed or not. And bear in mind that very often these things were pretty much transversal, and we remember them just because, for example, the winning side had won with that, but we're not told anything about the losing side. Maybe had the same thing, but since they lost, it was kind of irrelevant at that point. And don't think that even people who participated to those battles and wrote about them actually left us kind of understandable accounts, because military history is a much more complicated thing than in the historical sense, I mean, that than you imagine. And I personally specialize exactly on battles reconstruction, and I can tell you it takes an awful lot of time, an incredibly brutal method, and an incredible diachronic and comparative experience to actually give a suitable explanation of what happened technically. And for a good part, we will never know anyway. Right? So this is the condition in which we normally are. So when you look at the spread of bows, also crossbows, we've seen it in the case of the Picts during the early Middle Ages, we realized that this weapon had always been important. Right? There is a debate on whether, what was the relation between slings and bows. From ancient to medieval times, it seems in medieval times the latter took kind of over compared to the former. This is another thing that I'm not going to discuss today. However, it's evident that in spite of, again, of the literary chivalric notionistic ideas, bows were constantly used everywhere, all the time, without concern. Also because even the lower estates that used this weapon were brought to war, ruled, command, order, trained by the elite, by the nobility. So the nobility was, of course, much more aware of the effectiveness of weapons than any other element of society, and knew how to use those weapons even better than those from which they were defeated at some point, as we were saying at the beginning of the early 14th century. In fact, there was never even technically a kind of a communal or let's say rustic victory per se, because all these communities had knights within them that worked as instructors that, let's say, gave the example, ordered the formations and all this stuff. And a discrete volume of fire had always been present in Western armies. We also overlook how mounted archery was spread since early medieval times throughout all the Middle Ages on a regular basis in all Western sedentary European armies. Right? And always consider that in a narrower sense, we think of the West-West, but there had always been kind of a broader East looming, right? Even from the westernmost side, you have the Muslims that inject a little bit more of archery in the Iberian Peninsula than it was the case, likely. Let's not exaggerate, but, also because the Iberian Peninsula had always been about also hit-and-run tactics, skirmishes, we were talking about it the other day, in fact, etc. But especially, it's as if, the westernmost historiography naturally took over the world because of mainly the development of Britain and France, didn't consider, and as you know, in Schwerpunkt I often talk about this, areas such as not even, obviously, Eastern Europe per se, that is naturally more peripheral and less advanced, whatever, but even very close areas like Central Europe, the Balkans, and other fringes, like as far as the injection of some kind of Eastern tactics, for example, was concerned. Think about the Huns, the Avars, the Arabs, the Magyars. Well, these were all peoples that, especially, the nomadic ones, semi-nomadic ones, had an enormous archer bias. The Arabs, a little bit less, arguably, but still more than the Westerners. And again, as I was saying before, not necessarily because of greater tactical superiority. The same goes for these semi-nomadic peoples that eventually all get either crushed by a Western sedentary force and or basically become one themselves, like the Magyars, albeit, yes, retaining, made lots of videos about medieval Hungarian warfare, some kind of steppe flavor, also because the steppe is literally next door across the Carpathians, or even in the Danubian corridor. That, however, did leave their mark. I mean, just think about how the Ottonians had to cope with the Magyar threat, how their heavy cavalry coped with the, in fact, with the Hungarian horse archers, etc. And naturally, there had been consistent waves of this, right? Again, for most of Western Europe, the migration era fundamentally ends in the second half of the 6th century. For Central and Eastern Europe, things are very different. Even the Balkans, the Byzantines fundamentally absorb an atrocious lot of all these steppe mercenaries and settle them, and properly in their imperial military replicate, also fighting against either steppe peoples or Easterners in the near Middle East, against enemies that have much more archery, right? So there is always an important influence from these populations. As late as the late Middle Ages, it never ended, really. Think about Mongol warfare. In autumn, I made a little series about various aspects of Mongol warfare, also how the Westerners properly looked at their tactics and what they thought of it. And at the end of the day, we've seen that probably even Mongol warfare that still suscitates today a sort of, fearful respect is surely not tactically underrated, but technologically so, right? And that's also yet another proof that you can be a more primitive people and still being successful if you have the adequate moral load. Naturally, you can't have just that. The Mongols were quite advanced because of Chinese warfare that had absorbed, also with, very often as primitive peoples do, without too many kind of cultural resistance, right, to bigger civilizations. But indeed, if we look just at this, again, this first shock against, the Mongols had, super armor that was good against arrows, and their arrows were so terrible. But then, by the 13th century, you see the Ilkhanate needing Western crossbowmen to cope with their local warfare, and then you start questioning. The Westerners stop being pressed with Mongol warfare quite early, also not just because the Mongols wouldn't invade Europe anymore, but just because things, again, are not much a matter of technology, but just of kind of that moral kind of output that, in the Mongol case, also Mongolia was not really a civilization. For as long as Mongol Empire was created, it was done so on the base of other regional powers, and then Mongolia remained Mongolia, just like Arabia remained Arabia after the Islamic invasions, and it mostly their legacy lived in one of our countries. Just the other day I was talking about this for, in fact, the same Ilkhanate of Persia. So naturally things are more impressive when seen from maybe an Eastern European perspective, because the Mongols of Batu Khan, that from the Urals reversed themselves on the Rusian first, and then the Polish principalities, arriving up to Bohemia, Hungary, even the gates of Germany. They even crossed the Alps into Italy, and even crushed the Teutonic Knights, were quite of an archery advanced people, as we have just explained, right? However, and I also talked about this in that video about the fact that, as I'm deeply convinced that the Mongols would have never managed to conquer Europe, even if they had wanted to, the West had been developing a dramatic firepower on its own. Sure, if you look at the biblical symbology and still that traditional awareness of the fact that, of course, the bow was the weapon of the evil, of Satan, of the devil, you surely have the deep sense that the trails of the Mongols were easily connected with this monstrous population emerged from Gog and Magog at the end of the world, just as a scourge for the sins of the Christians. And so it was not random that they were horse archers mainly. There is some beautiful image from the Hortus Deliciarum of Herrade von Landsberg that I also inserted here among one of the pictures with Goliath, and that I also used for that video about, I think it was the 1180 Western Night, that I based it on that manuscript illumination. You can notice that the angels are attributed some chivalric weapons, the shield and the long cross-shaped sword, while to the devils bows and arrows are left. And after all, not just to them, because also to death herself, and to the plague, as also in the personified representations, also in on the horsemen of the apocalypse, for example. From the plague of 1347-1350 onwards, the saint martyrized by arrow shot Sebastian became the protector par excellence against, in fact, these trails of contagion, right? That was thought to have been shot literally to people, just like another version of Cupid was for falling in love, except here dying of bubonic plague. So in spite of this, as I was saying, the bow did have a major development during the High Middle Ages. Most of all, we'll talk about this now. Of course, the crossbow, right? That remains by far the single most important missile weapon until the surpassing carried out of firearms. Not even the longbow, in spite of the fact it was adopted also in Burgundy, in other, say, doctrinally speaking, on the imitation of the English armies, really ever managed to supplant, or it was not even meant to, that in the first place, the crossbow. There were countries that sold and produced properly, for example, through Lombard wood, longbows to England during the same 100 Years' War that kept using just crossbows. And even though they had English mercenaries, such as the ones of the White Company of John Oakwood, famously enough, in the Italian peninsula, never thought to adopt the longbow, because evidently they were fine the way they were, which is really meaningful. You know, the Genoese crossbowmen also faced the longbowmen during the 100 Years' War in the French armies, and even there say usually, well, that's the proof that a longbow is superior to crossbow. Actually, there is not, and Anglo-Saxon historiography has pointed that out brilliantly in the last years. Actually, any evidence of the fact that this was the case, because numbers were different, terrain was different, several conditions are different. Literally, the sources do not tell that explicitly, nor it seems that the Genoese crossbowmen ever lost prestige in the French armies after even incidents or alleged ones happening, because of the sense of French nobility or contempt towards foot soldiers and things like that. The reason why knights, men-at-arms, do not use that often the bow, and generally speaking they're not even represented like that, is in part the obvious traditional meaning that I said before. I mean, these guys are swordsmen. They're lancers on horse, but why should they be represented as skirmishers? We're timid, not to smash into the enemy with several hundreds of kilos of horse, of men, of armor, and everything, because that was the greatest prize and the most exalted dream that any nobleman could have in the first place, in proving the moral superiority that entails. The other reason being, of course, that this way of war was much more functional than the the skirmishing one, the missile one. Even though, again, it would have been really common to see, I don't know, on 13th century battlefields, a knight going to even to the charge with a crossbow as a side weapon, as opposed to an axe or something else, right? It could be interchangeable in that regard. The importance of missile warfare during the High Middle Ages is witnessed by this strengthening of armor. But even about this, we don't have to be fooled. First of all, armor was not solely conceived to withstand missile fire. Armor was primarily designed to withstand traumatic blows from swords, from other from other both cutting and traumatic, say, blunt weapons, and generally speaking, until in fact the introduction of firearms that fundamentally stimulates the development of plate armor further, you realize that the cutting capacity of the sword were continuously improved against the coat of mail, right? A coat of mail doesn't get cut easily or substantially by a single sword blow. But the optimal concept is that the two, sword and coat of mail, have to neutralize each other. Right then, with plate armor, you have mostly double-handed swords that have to mostly confer like a powerful trauma to disintegrate the system that keeps the plate armor together and try eventually with other weapons. In fact, also, this could be achieved, in fact, in the late Middle Ages also with hammers and things like this. But having also side weapons like stocks and stuff like that to literally, stick that into the uncovered parts between armor that were also covered in mail still by a degree. So there was a leveling of this, and of course missile weapons were equally insidious again, but they weren't the same thing, right? It's not because of the crossbow that just plate armor, kind of armor in general, evolved, right? And you have that probably if the crossbow had not come about and or other missile weapons had not improved, which is unrealistic to think in the first place, civilization and technologically, yes, the armor would have been slightly different, but technically speaking, and essentially speaking, they're the same, right? The quality of armor doesn't even consist in kind of the structural typology, but even just the material. We have seen that in the video about lamellar armor, for example. And the perhaps most important aspect of this is that horses, so essentially the natural element in which the size of arm at this point is based, were armored to a less degree than the knights that rode them. And we know from all the medieval sources practically that wherever there was archery involved, horses suffered an incredible amount of losses, right? You hear normally, like I studied mostly the 13th to 14th century, every battle says there were lots of horses dead, or something like that. There were hundreds of horses dead, and maybe just a few tens of men-at-arms dead. They don't tell usually how many commoners died in the first place, so even there we have to be cautious, but the commoners were not so fully armored normally, right? The moment of greater armoredness is fundamentally the 15th century. Even there, just an elite is fully armored. The same goes for the horses, right? Some horses had also metal armor extensively by the 13th century, 14th century. The point is that it was such a small minority, also created problems for maneuverability, so that they were mostly put in reserve and things like this. So in any case, here we'll not make the story of Western tactics just per se. However, just consider that most horses were particularly vulnerable to the arrows, which may sound strange if you consider that in steppes warfare practically not just the horses, but also the horsemen were practically unarmored on a regular basis. And in that case, it's just that the volume of fire was so big that it was more important to invest in it as a defense than as a collective mass of horsemen than armor, right? In part also because of the horses' vulnerability, the fact that it cost too much to just armor them integrally. So the importance of missile warfare is witnessed also in as much sometimes the men-at-arms decided to dismount, chiefly because of difficult terrain, because, again, missile fire per se does not stop cavalry charges. Always remember this, there is no scenario, historically, in which cavalry charges are stopped by longbowmen, crossbowmen. It did not happen. The only way this could happen if there was, again, heavy infantry in between them, right, to defend from cavalry. Otherwise, it would be a combined armed tactics. But alone, missile fire is not properly conceived to stop cavalry, because we're always talking about battle lines. It doesn't matter if one lucky shot manages to take down a horse or enter into the isolate of a helmet or a splinter, within the various layers of armor and cause some nasty wound. It's irrelevant, because the only thing that matters in these battles is the collective order, how cohesive is a battle line, how much impacts in the enemy one. And there is no doubt that missile weapons did cause a damage, did help slowing down the enemy attacks and rendering them more disorderly and thus ineffective. But they would have never been able to do it alone, right? And especially in the most important battles, where literally, that the larger the battles, the more difficult the outcome, say more balanced the outcome, but in this sense also less, say more predictable, the ratios are going to remain, even at least in the moment of combat. Whereas if you have smaller engagements, you can have more easily things like, one guy killing 10, right? As still unlikely it is, but it's more likely the smaller the engagement. So there is no doubt that in skirmishes, in ambushes, during explorations, whatever, it was useful to have mounted archers, right? That in Western Europe always were around, mounted crossbowmen, no doubt, also in consistent numbers. But at that point, you can even count on precision fire, short range, and you can count on some kind of greater individual skills. But as far as open field engagements, pitched battles, the most important one, tactically and strategically, the archer has just an auxiliary role, as it had always had it, because it's just damn light infantry, and light infantry is by definition light infantry because it cannot hold the ground against heavy arms, whether cavalry or infantry, right? So when we talk about the English longbow, first of all, we have to get completely out of our mind that this was something that developed magically from somewhere like southern Wales, or that the Welsh had anything to teach the English about archery. First of all, we know throughout all the 13th century that English archers were paid better than the Welsh ones, that there is no evidence that the Welsh or anyone, for that matter, in Britain had any specific upper hand in the quality of archery, just per se. Why the reason why the people fixated with Welsh archery, thinking that it was such a big deal, is that Welsh archers were praised in a famous ethnography of the 12th century, and that's it. Right, without any comparative evidence, without any even military historical evidence, as a matter of fact. Just once we know that the Welsh archers made a massacre of Irish infantry in Ireland under the English, but that's it. Again, we see that the English archers were actually even more renowned. Some woodsmen in the Midlands had quite a reputation and tradition for archery. And what seems to have been, if anything, a British bias in favor of bows as opposed to crossbows that were there anyhow, was likely of political and social nature, especially these kind of more fringe areas surely had, were poorer, they could more easily hired, right? That's the reason why there were so many Welsh archers. It's not that there were anything better or worse than the English ones, but just it was easier for, to hire them because they were more desperate in a sense to make a living of the military career. But it's not just that, right? The English at least got adapted to this seemingly during the 13th century. In the previous centuries, there may be some hint of a greater kind of infantry capacity of the English compared, say, to the French. This is, as far as I understand, not entirely fully demonstrated. At least I made videos about this. There is the idea that less feudal the background, and that some areas of England took a while before being fully kind of feudalized, right? At least the frontier was always in turmoil. It was, the connections with France were obviously greater in the Saxon area, in the southeast mostly. That also had more resources, concentration of power. So this idea of a sort of Celtic and Norse bias, especially the latter in favor of, double-handed axes or something, has brought some people to say, oh, well, but maybe the English had kind of a, more developed infantry since Anglo-Saxon times. There doesn't seem to be trace of this, especially, in fact, in Norman times. And by the 13th century, England's just like a perfectly feudal country. There's not much of a bias in favor of infantry. However, it's possible that because of the aforementioned reasons, it was easier to hire a local bowman without needing even to equip him with crossbow or something that would do what he had to do and would be sufficient even to cope, for example, with the Scottish schiltrons. There is, on the other hand, between the 13th and the 14th century, a deliberate choice from the English monarchy to artificially create a specifical social estates. That is to say, the yeomen or freeholders. These were free peasants. The English peasantry was not dramatically free at the time. I made a video about this. However, this was still in some areas, again, it was possible to boost their autonomy a bit further against the nobility from the monarchic side. And this was kind of the equivalent of, the free cities of the empire in Germany, etc. I mean, the idea of having some, in this case, peasant communities, commoners, rustics, that would be under the direct royal jurisdiction without a feudal intermedium, let's say. And the idea is that these troops had to be fit, trained, ready to provide, in fact, good archers that were seen probably also as the crossbow was in the communal militias of continental Europe, like an effective anti-cavalry weapon, also in a political sense. So for the crown to mitigate a little bit the power of the nobility, the 13th century, after all, was a development, also the peak of commoners' development in general. Like, it's the peak of feudal culture as well, but in parallel you have the commoners developing remarkably, albeit under the feudal hierarchy. And as far as single campaigns were concerned, managing to field adequate numbers of these troops between mercenaries and but mostly they were subjects, at least because Wales at least was finally conquered at this point, directly controlled by the English. So they could simply form important masses against especially the northern neighbors. This is after the English loss essentially of most continental possessions. So as you know, Edward I started his wars against the Scots, and these were more infantry biased fighters, not because of any particular legacy. It was simply, and this could be the case also for the rest of Britain, as we were saying before, because they had less resources, right? England overall was rich. Scotland definitely wasn't as much, at least. and thus it was also Scotland was less of a feudal country than England was, which means that there was a less centralized government, less political cohesion overall, less surplus, so also less elite as far as the mounted knights were concerned. While there were lots of kind of freemen that weren't particularly affluent by any standard, however, were many, and somehow brutal and primitive enough to be able to get themselves killed or kill on a battlefield with an important degree of cohesion. And this is what essentially we see during the Scottish Wars. I made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and we'll have to really cover the entire picture in detail because it's, as you know, very, very fascinating. But banally speaking, from the English side, you realize that at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, the Scots were defeated, even in their kind of sheltered, kind of thickly packed infantry formations, because they were adequately showered by the English arrows before being dealt with the heavier troops. And this had proven, it's a bit more complex than this, but still the softening up moment had to the English archery had been quite impacting, right? And ever since, also because of some defeats that the English actually suffered at the end of the Scots, and thanks also to the sturdy resistance of their infantries, took the habit of at least, dismounting a bit more frequently than what their continental counterparts did, which absolutely doesn't mean that the default doctrine of the English during the 100 Years' War was dismounting the men-at-arms just because, right? This is a very kind of wargamistic presumption. Actually, the reason why in the greatest battles of the 100 Years' War the English were dismounted is that they were in numerical inferiority, and thus also in a defensive position, and generally in a general condition of inferiority in the first place, accordingly. Thus it was better at that point to dismount, so because in terms of impact they could have not withstood the French one, so trying to exploit the advantages of defense otherwise, using actually the same combined armed tactics of men-at-arms, supported by, in fact, the also a consistent number of archers that often were more than the enemy crossbowmen, that evidently were thought to be enough also to kind of match this English firepower, that evidently was not necessarily that greater than the one of the opponents. Again, the reasons of the English victories are much more orthodox than, in a strictly tactical sense, than as it's not showed by any source of the reason of the weapons that they were employing, right? I consider that these English infantrymen did have crossbows themselves in these battles, right? So it was not just about longbows in the first place, but mostly so. That is true. So the crossbow, the crossbow had kind of a greater development. The longbow was paradoxically more common than the crossbow up to some point in the early or high Middle Ages. Again, because that had always existed. Also, the crossbow had always existed since ancient times. It had never died out. The fact that we can't document it very well before the 11th, the 10th, the 12th century is doesn't mean that it wasn't there consistently. Also, much before, throughout all the early Middle Ages. In any case, the crossbow developed dramatically and spread dramatically to become the single most important weapon that was to last as still the most important pre-firearm one until the mid-16th century, right? The reason of the crossbow success is that it's very easy to use, right? In order to know how to shoot a bow, it requires a very long time after which you can still cut your chick while unloading, etc. While the crossbow just takes a couple of months to become a proficient user. It has dreadly power, right? It has this kind of bulky short projectile, the quarrel. There are other names, actually. There are various typologies that are easy to confuse. It mostly has to do with the cross section. The quarrel has a pyramid at the tip, which for physical reasons, and now I don't have the time to digress on, is better suited to impact, to damage armor, right, as opposed to other kind of conic tips instead that are better used to pierce the humble meat of a human being, as much as of a hunting prey. And the whole, again, mythology that the bow was better because, at least if we had enough draw, so mostly in the case of the longbow, it simply had a higher rate of fire, so it had to win. It's not demonstrated. It's not actually explicitated by any source that I know of to make any consistent difference. Even less relevant are the alleged tests that today are made on replicas or whatever, that, given that I don't even know how people have the courage to do these things and pretending that it has any historical relevance, right? First of all, okay, they're replicas, so even if you knew exactly how they were built, which technically speaking we don't, even when we have still the actual pieces, like the Mary Rose relics or things like this, doesn't tell us about the tons of others that were used at different times everywhere that surely weren't particularly different, but that we cannot recreate quite in the way they did. But that especially, even if we could, we still wouldn't know what kind of effect they would have on a medieval battlefield, because we cannot recreate a medieval battlefield, and therefore, given the factors involved and the possible influence and approximations and margins of error, it's a completely pointless exercise to go out there and proclaiming that, given that you can do something with this replicas, this tells us something satisfactorily convincing about what happened on a medieval battlefield. That is a mirage. It's a delusion. It's just a way to spend time. Like, if you want to make it a hobby, make it a hobby, but don't pretend that warfare can be reduced to this, especially when you have, if you actually studied any of them comprehensively, not just quoting random stuff as if you were picking, items in a supermarket, that the battle accounts overall and the history of the art of war in this period tells us the opposite of what you would like to believe. So that these weapons were, particularly deadly, or whether there is not even a need of a replica to understand, for example, the value of weapons, just in terms of what the contemporaries thought of them, in terms of effectiveness, what they could achieve on the battlefield. And if you read what, again, the battle accounts care about, they are completely careless. They don't give a fuck about technology. It's completely alien to their mindset. And you know why? Because it was the case that factor was irrelevant, and it's systemically irrelevant. There is not an exception. There can be an account that brags about the fact, I cut in half a knight with a halberd. Yes, okay, how is that an evidence if no other account tells us the same thing? In a millennium of history, of course, halberds were there, not all throughout it, but let's not be too picky. You understand the concept here. And when you have the actual explanation of much more significant tactical events on the battlefield that explain why a battle line was broken rather than another, there is not an evidence, of course, that any battle line was stopped by any missile troops, right? And that's what matters. at the end of the day. No doubt that they did cause damage, no doubt that they could kill, no doubt that they could even pierce armor in certain circumstances or combinations, but the overall impact of them can be easily sensed on a collective level when you actually study and reconstruct the battle accounts. So, and when you understand the sheer scale of approximation and complexity that those accounts provide just to reconstruct the battle, the fact that you create a replica shooting one arrow at a time, when this thing could be completely different on a battlefield where, of course, most of the shot was zone-based and kind of volley rhythm, etc. And even by the degree that we don't know, of course, how many troops were stationed where on the wings or how they moved or whatever, it's completely irrelevant, because we just know that during the course of that battle, you don't have even that perfect linearity for which you can think the weapons could be employed effectively at a given point, right? Even among those that won, for example. So I am extremely critical about this. You perfectly know that if you follow me from quite some time, and I will always bring my actual expertise, because it's the only one I have on medieval tactics that you can reflect on at least. The same story that the crossbow was seen as illegitimate weapon, again, that would have been allegedly banned, right? The point why it was banned by the papacy, that most people know just the notion of it. The papacy at some point thought the crossbow was bad, and so because it killed unfairly, or it was used to kill Christians, and this is the reason why it was banned. And then, of course, the crossbow boomed anyway. The obvious context that everybody knows or should know is the fact that those crossbows were being used at the same time of the specific ban by heretics that were essentially communistically trying to subvert the established order, and that were, by the way, brutally massacred by still the knights that would have suffered the most from such weapons. And nobody cared to stress this thing anymore. Of course, weapons were seen always rhetorically, this terrible thing, it kills people, it would be much better if we were all at peace, and so a war is brutal, and it's scary, and it's terrifying, whatever. But weapons are just a mean to an end, and they're not just, it's always what's in the human mind that matters, and how you can control it that eventually makes things right. There are countries in the world that have the greatest amount of private firearms ownership, that are also the ones that have the single lowest cases of mass shootings and killings and incidents with firearms. And so that naturally speaks of the only thing that actually matters, that is politics, society, and culture in general. Crossbowmen were naturally, as we were saying before, literally all over the place. There were some famous ones. There were the Gascons, for example. They are famous mainly because the English hired them from France, so injecting a bit of crossbows from a more kind of a non-British influenced pool. Especially, of course, the Genoese crossbowmen, that became a model properly of business connected with their city-state. They were employed widely by France, exactly, again, as we were saying before, against the English. They developed in a context mostly of maritime warfare and of advanced siege engineering technology and other stuff. So there were many types of bows, right? As we haven't perhaps talked so much about it, but it's a bit like early firearms. There wasn't a neat division between just artillery and bows, even. Like, you had crossbows that increased in size, let's say from the hand one used on the battlefield just to move. Also from the earlier times, it was something more modest to something more sophisticated, with different levels types of draw, and heavier ones used in the castles, and then up to arriving to artillery, right? Also, muskets were technically early artillery that became firearms, and vice versa, because there was just a degree of the application of the same technology in different directions. Surely there weren't giant longbows in the sense of, longbow artillery for obvious reasons. The crossbow has, various advantages, including the fact that you can simply place it somewhere without relying essentially on the tension of your arms. You can shoot it while you are crouched. You can still today, there are military crossbows employed, military bows employed, and they have pros and cons. This now is not so relevant to digress on. In any case, what we see in the West throughout all this time is that the employment of bows in general did not even approach the levels that existed in the East, right? Especially the use of mounted archery never became generalized in Europe. Archers and crossbowmen remained mostly just infantrymen. There always were horse archers and horse crossbowmen in Western Europe throughout all the Middle Ages. The fact that we can document it or not in some of the darkest times has no historical relevance whatsoever. They were there, everybody knows it, and simply any fighter uses whatever the hell he was, right? Knights themselves used the lances in any possible way, all the time, in every era. They could use it overarm, underarm, crochet, they could throw it. Hell. This happened in every single era. There has ever been a horseman. So what would be the optimal employ given the current times arms strength ratio is another issue. Still, you could see everything on a battlefield. The important spread of missile weapons, of course, during the high Middle Ages is in parallel with the development of, as we've seen, communal infantries, mostly, that, of course, are interested in stopping cavalry and or simply for political as military reasons, right? You can go out to war against an enemy that has cavalry. You want to deploy these men on the wings so that while the cavalries clash against each other, you shoot at the horses. But when you are back home, you may be threatening your own men-at-arms as noblemen, aristocrats, because you want to obtain more political recognition, prerogatives, and especially, in the city streets, you can start making ambushes, creating problems to cavalry, and shooting this stuff, this bows at point blank range with devastating effect. And this definitely spread together with the increase in wealth, the trade shift in favor of the West since the 11th centuries and so on. The amount of armoredness, right? You would see in battle everything raining. We have impressive volumes of fire, things like tens of thousands of quarrels falling on an army in an hour, right? So in the largest pitched battles documented at the time, so the sheer level, there were entire wings of thousands of pikemen in closely interlocked kind of shield formation of the word really disbanded, right? The collapse under such fire. There is evidently again the aforementioned massacre of horses during this phase. These tactics were enacted against the horse archers of the Middle East, right? At the Battle of Arsuf, the peasant crossbowmen, protected by other infantry and, supporting the English crusading cavalry, successfully repelled the Egyptian, the Ayyubid horse archers. And you can see there that throughout the 13th century, even though at that point feudal culture was at its peak, and the battle accounts tell us that, say, among the army there were infantry men, but they do not talk about them during the clash. We definitely understand that it was an incredible tactical development, and especially optimized synergy between the various arms. Synergy, for the ignorant that say, it's just a word for those who don't. Synergy is the Greek equivalent of the Latin cooperation. So if you don't understand what it means, the synergy between the various arms, it's not because people want to use strange languages, because you're too ignorant to know that, right? Just pick a freaking dictionary and learn how to speak your own language. Aside from this, cavalry became heavier, right? There is a shock element that fundamentally keeps increasing over the 13th to 14th century, and that goes even beyond, again, the alleged crisis that occurred during the early 14th century. Yes, it's true, knights could dismount, like big battles like Azincourt, where the terrain also in part obliged them to do so, but generally speaking, the shock effect of a cavalry charge on European battlefields is something that you can find very, very, very late. We've seen it at the Battle of Austerlitz that the clash between the French and the Russian cuirassiers on the Pratzen was so loud that it could be heard at miles of distance. Literally, people, human beings, smashing themselves at 90 kilometers per hour, summing at this the minimum of canter. But they did go at gallop at some point with that massive beefy horses and all the cuirasses and broken bones, broken spines, chopped head, all the thing. The people were habituated to this, right? If you were a knight, that's basically the only thing you had to get through. And just think about, not only the one, but say the most terrifying one, for which you have just, if you want to be a knight, you must do this, otherwise you don't do that, right? So that's it. That's the level of moral superiority of a medieval knight. And if things go wrong, yes, you die horribly, but again, cavalry does remain until the rise of the second Swiss infantries in the second half, in fact, of the 15th century, the decisive arm. And actually, many areas of Europe, also during the early modern age, the ones that could not afford so much technical advancement, particular firearms technology, whatever, it was feudal cavalry that remained there as the decisive arm. Right, so this aspect of the late Middle Ages becoming more challenging for the men-at-arms and requiring ever greater expanses, technically improved armor, tougher horse breeds. I made a video about the 15th century war horse. They naturally become also heavier, slower, and they need also lighter cavalry specialties to act, etc. Again, as long as they existed, it means that they were functional. Right, the shock role of cavalry is intrinsic in cavalry herself. Cavalry cannot do anything else but charging. Right, you can use, of course, horse archers and other even firearms as with having the missile element on mobile platforms. But the concept of cavalry is that it can only attack because a cavalry unit that withstands the enemy staying still there gets immediately overrun. And the worst thing, cavalry would always remain out there, even in times of pike squares, of the prevalence of infantry. Like the peak of infantry in that sense was, say, the moment of greatest shrinking of cavalry, let's put it in this way, was the mid-16th century, in which still there were cuirassiers, and next to the reiter, the skirmishers, that were often sometimes the same thing, because every cavalry also can charge. Even horse archers can just smash you with their weight, especially if you are light infantry. But you still have kind of a shock effect that is inherent in the mount and in the possibility of employing it in that fashion, right? So there was never an end of cavalry throughout this period. Throughout most of the late Middle Ages, cavalry was the decisive arm, right? And even when infantry took over, it's not because the people who fought on horseback were not in control politically. They were the same people who paid the infantry they hired, right? And that's a political reason, a political motive, including the one for the infantry to enlist in that regard. And we made lots of videos about modern warfare. I'm not going to digress on it now. So when you look at such heavy blows like Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, Azincourt, 1415, you cannot avoid to see a structural failure of French cavalry in all what it represented archetypically, but not a failure of cavalry per se, right? Because this is just France in a clash against England that has a very specific military system, again, that came about because of the particular unity of the and kind of military interest, intervention, dirigism of the English monarchy, that came from some clashes with in the Celtic fringe when there was more infantry, and where they found themselves in certain strategic situations in France that brought them to just fight dismounted, because otherwise during the chevauchée, where I also made a video about probably the army strength and composition of the 100 Years' War from the English side, still had lots of cavalry. Were often mounted. Were some chevauchés that were led essentially by mounted contingents, right? For skirmishes, raids, whatever, that was crucial, right? And many other tactical, strategic purposes. But again, this is the northwestern corner of Europe. If you look at Spain, if you look at Germany, if you look at Italy, you do not find this. You find cavalry being in charge. Yes, dismounting more frequently, but mostly mounted, thus still cavalry by definition. And hardly also any erosion of the nobiliar primacy. On the contrary, a consolidation of nobiliar power over the exhausted estates of Europe after the big crisis of the 14th century. This was largely also a voluntary process, right? Not just an impositive or oppressive one, right? The communities had to work. Cavalry still made its work, and when it wouldn't, gradually the same elites began to create infantry armies with still cavalry operating together with them. People look at but look at the Hussites. They started another infantry revolution. Where, right? First of all, they operated in a situation which, if they had been fighting on French or Italian battlefields, they would have had their Wagenburgs smashed by artillery. Secondly, how large were these armies? Right? They were quite contained. We made multiple videos about Hussite armies, generally speaking, and you can't even say there that cavalry was not important for them. right? They were just very motivated, fanatically driven, well led and organized against an enemy that mostly fought on horseback and then suffered casualties and got repeatedly defeated until what happened to the Hussites, what happened to Bohemia. It was a terrible disaster, right? And nobody remembers the consequences of those tactics that, by the way, are used since antiquity. Using a Wagenburg was done everywhere. It was done, all over Western Europe from centuries and centuries. There are lots of examples during the 11th to 12th centuries. Plenty of Wagenburgs in the West, successfully also, countering cavalry before, again, that mid-12th century, after which, things changed more directly in not just in favor of cavalry, but again in favor of large composite articulate massive armies of tens of thousands of men that nobody really understands also why they would think were an exception in medieval times. If you make a list of medieval battles, you often find lots of battles with pretty large armies. So this mythology that, the Middle Ages for some reason had its warfare more crippled by siege warfare. Well, why? Because, in the ancient world this did not exist. There were more politically cohesive systems, but also ancient historiography doesn't talk as much as medieval historiography for different cultural reasons, but also ones of documentary preservation about what was, even in ancient world, the typical warred war of raids, of sieges, of ambushes, whatever, that you do find like in any war, and that was present also in the Middle Ages. So we keep leaving this kind of delusion. You see, the English normally also used mounted men-at-arms. The general, like even Tudor armies, like I made a video specifically about Tudor cavalry, and they were a necessary complement. And actually, especially in England, where not much of a great infantry developed, paradoxically, after the 100 Years' War, and that remained actually behind compared to continental developments, cavalry even had a greater importance. Again, the reason is political, just as much as during the Wars of the Roses, most English armies were compact and dismounted, and it was mostly a matter of getting over with as those dynastic struggles of literal biological elimination for the sake of succession were concerned. So again, there is not a fixed sense that, cavalry was over. Ask a Tudor knight if he thought that cavalry was over. Right? So it doesn't sound very, very insightful, but again, people must somehow believe this stuff. Plus consider also another aspect, really, which doesn't mean to diminish the importance of infantry, but still considering comparatively how strong cavalry really was. In the aforementioned Crécy, Poitiers, Azincourt, first of all, we're looking at, again, combined arms tactics, in which, if possible, cavalry was still employed, right? Given mostly the English took very strong defensive positions that helped as terrain, right, to boost their defense, right? The men-at-arms did most of the job, not the missile auxiliaries, if we can't call them this way. Also, field fortifications are another big deal. This aspect is often overlooked. Or better, we all know that, we've seen it at the Battle of Poitiers specifically, but hedges, sharp stakes fixed on the ground that you sometimes can not use. For example, if terrain is soft, there were instances during the 100 Years' War, and which was the case, and which still the English won, I think, in that occasion. The let's say the same effect, swamps and heavy terrain proper that could bog down not just the cavalry, but legitimately also any advancing men-at-arms in the first place, or tire him down at least. And this stuff is also an equation, that it's a factor in the equation that we cannot measure mathematically. If you were to make a cross-section of the reasons, or the comprehensive reason why, say, an army of the 100 Years' War won a battle, say the English ones in defense, so it's easier to make as an example. How can you measure in percentage how much, that victory was owed? First of all, you can actually, yes, definitely see that the heavy element is decisive. So of course it's the men-at-arms, it's the battle lines. The terrain can never be as difficult as to just be decisive. Otherwise, the enemy from the other side wouldn't even attack you, and that's what technically happened with castles, with other fortifications, with particularly difficult terrain, whatever, etc. But if you were to especially measure the impact that the longbowmen had, or archers in general, because again, we don't even know sometimes how many longbowmen and how many crossbowmen the English had, respectively, and that's already a question mark. And how much instead the field, the ditches, the hedges, the fortification did, you wouldn't be able to quantify it. There's no way, historically, you cannot know how much the tip of the iceberg that eventually made the thing was decided by this or this other element. And always maintaining that, a good 40% depended anyway on the men-at-arms. And so these other aspects are minor, and so the tip of the iceberg is just, unknown in the first place, because it's the sum of it all, it's not just what you see at the top. Right? It's like people who think that World War I, so the Western Front not moving but a few tens of kilometers for 4 years because of machine guns and shells. Never mind the German and the French and military industries, or political will, or, the fact that there were troops in large... No, it must be the technology. You see, this is a mental disease. It's an autoimmune mental disease that people cannot cure, apparently, anymore. And still lots of adults vote, think the world, teach their children whatever, believing this nonsense. Right? For a simple incapacity of distinguishing between absolute and relative, that every, I think, first grader should already be able to understand. So, this is just the battlefields of the 100 Years' War. Naturally, you do have interesting events, let's say, taking place also in other countries. And at least as far as let's say, as Eastern Europe, broadly meant at least, is concerned, there is surely another factor that challenges Western heavy cavalry, however, on a different ground than the one it was normally habituated to operate. Right? And we're talking about the rise of the Ottomans and specifically the crusading defeats at the battles of Nicopolis in 1396 and Varna in 1444. I never covered them already. We will surely talk about them in the future. In any case, there is, as you know, in these battles a consistent display of tactical flexibility and an enveloping capacity from the side of the Ottomans, essentially with light infantry and cavalry, that give ground to the enemy, or envelope it, make it attack in the center, and bet everything on essentially even in there, essentially a fortified position in the center with some kind of heavy infantry, at least not as heavy as the Western one, because the Ottomans will never quite have it. They had at best the janissaries, right, that were equipped with various weapons, but generally speaking, they had also bow, scimitar, dagger, right, that would have to hold their ground until the refused wings would come back and re-envelope on the flanks of the Crusader cavalry that, as I was saying at the beginning, did prove to be unstoppable frontally, and that required this outflanking maneuver to successfully be dealt with, right? Naturally, when we see again these important defeats of the French cavalry in the 100 Years' War, Nicopolis and Varna, that are also, again, there are the Burgundians, there are actually the Western cavalry in general, also from Central Europe, etc. We do see, again, the situation of the men-at-arms to aggravate further. And it cannot be denied that against these tactics, the Westerners found themselves at least unbalanced at the moment, as much as they had been against the Mongols. This, on the long run, wouldn't mean that the Ottomans would be able to develop an effective tactical system to defeat the Western world to core, right? Actually, the Westerners held, right? The Ottomans managed to expand in the Balkans, that were quite of a politically fractured reality already at the time, and in some against such a sick giant like the Kingdom of Hungary was at the end of the Middle Ages. The reasons of their success are mostly political. However, the Ottomans inject in Eastern and Central Europe and the Balkans further steppeness, even though what we call the Turks, at least the Ottoman Turks, were essentially Westerners themselves. I mean, they were born on the Bosphorus. So areas that had been, say, Western, yes, okay, a bit more diluted ethnically, culturally in that sense, but still part of essentially the Western sphere, the Byzantine Empire and so on. So they weren't the, typical Central Asian by the time of Nicopolis and Varna. That's what I mean. In fact, we often underestimate how Western Ottoman armies were, which is something you can fully appreciate, especially when they fought against the Safavids in the east, and you see what they were practically about. They were almost something like a pike and shot army against the still a medieval Persian one, even though, again, the Ottomans never had much quite of a pike dimension or particularly strong stopping infantry. They did develop a lot of shot, right? By Nicopolis and Varna, not yet, because they also had their time before they fully developed an adequate firepower, but, this didn't exist even in the West. By the eventual, in fact, pike and shot degree, the Ottomans used pretty known weapons at the time. Now there was rather the fact that this East was re-advancing in the West to just meet with the latter in a more consistent military fashion. But their bow was the typical short composite one that was around for quite a while. In the East, it was a light and handy, kind of manageable weapon, used both by the cavalry and the infantry. It was rather hard to draw, right? It was the D-shaped one, and this is normal for the composite bow that is created exactly to create a greater draw with a smaller bow. And this did apply actually even a less rapid fire rate, which is a thing that, as we were saying before, even against the crossbow, it was not really a problem. The longbow didn't have any great advantage just because the crossbow is slower to reload. Actually, it does seem that overall, in a kind of flattened dimension, the crossbow still had a greater edge over the longbow in the first place, and they were pretty similar, telling the truth, in performance. But again, we don't have the exact numbers to measure what their collective, say, their doctrine of employment entailed in a broader sense. And at this point, say, of the Ottoman conquest, still you have crossbows practically everywhere, right? You have longbows developing, also because there were some English mercenaries going around in Italy, in Burgundy, and some were just imitations. Again, the longbow had always existed. Also in these other countries, it was just not chosen over the crossbow for general reasons that are not simply, okay, we don't know why, right? It's simply about the availability, how convenient that is, and that will also manifest on the battlefield. There was naturally at this point also firearms really beginning to have, especially from the 20s of the 15th century, a necessary role in the arsenals of the most updated European princes. The English wouldn't abandon their longbow for a very long time. There were some advocates for its use at the beginning of the English Civil War, where firearms anyhow were already and would remain prevalent anyway. Some militias would use the longbows, and let's say that these weapons became anachronistic by the mid 16th century. You can argue that early 16th century battlefields were still suited for crossbows, for longbows, right, in which were pretty nasty weapons and still collectively used to great effect, right? So let's say until Henry VIII, right, from the Elizabethan era onwards, there is some kind of greater, while maritime expansion of the English monarchy is still, however, as we were saying before, kind of a lagging behind in terms of terrestrial forces that will not be gapped until the new model army. Part of the reason, but not entirely so, this happened all over Europe, right? There was, by the mid-16th century, a moment of further crisis, say, internationally. However, the Elizabethan government rewarded more the great landed property to the disadvantage of the small landowners, and thus also of the civic traditions of the peasant and pastoral communities of the English kingdom. It's not just that, however, it's just that technology availability and the applicability of it doctrinally was rendering bows and crossbows obsolete, at least for military use. Of course, they survived as a sport. The English, again, from the 100 Years' War, had maintained, especially the yeomanry, etc., this sense that knowing how to use a longbow was still a matter of, of pride and of identity and of also kind of potential offensive capacity, of course. But this would essentially be maintained mostly in hunting, right? In those great festivals that had been established since the Middle Ages, in the times in which the longbow was still a thing, right, and was needed by the English monarchs to go at war against the Scots and the French. So what happened in England mirrors a bit what I was saying before regarding actually the loss of the freeman power during early modern times. So absolutely, the rise of infantries had nothing to do with an increased autonomy, political autonomy of the commoners, at all. So one last consideration is a bit more political and social. Because again, you have an early 14th century in which infantries, especially in some of the most backwards areas in Europe, with the notable exception being Flanders, that surely after Italy was the richest area in Europe, but still was living a struggle against the French monarchy. It was in crisis, so there were autonomistic capacities, but otherwise we're talking about the Scots, the Dithmarsh, the Frisians, even the Swiss that weren't particularly developed at the time, and in Switzerland had literally nothing, right, in terms of resources. Yet it's mostly in the 15th century they made the miracle there. Also militarily, they changed they ended the Middle Ages, militarily speaking. But after this first wave with the plague, with the demic collapse, with the economic crisis, all these communes and rustics decline brutally, right? Seigneurial, princely, monarchic governments fundamentally strengthen, at least on a local basis, their power, and there is a sort of refeudalization of warfare. You have much more mercenarism now, because these are not the monarchies of the 12th century, not even of the 13th, that were still somehow truly feudal, even though the feudal mechanisms of recruitment, as we'll see now had already failed since they had begun. I mean, the Carolingian Empire collapsed exactly because of that reason. But there is enough statalistic control on the economy for having enough money to hire mercenaries, many of which had already been infantrymen. Think about the Brabançons. I mean, all this kind of support element, again, that since the 12th to 13th century, so the peak of cavalry warfare, still was used to mostly go at war on a more prolonged time than the local communal militias would be willing to. The same goes for the fief holders. However, even though these troops were very often equipped also with anti-cavalry weapons, cavalry again remained on saddle, literally, and albeit many of them did die because of crossbow bolts cut to pieces by daggers and halberds and manneries and all this stuff, they still also killed many more, right? And they still were the decisive arm. So this was in part the process directly occurring from a monarchy that was again increasing, for example, the bourgeois participation to government and administration, hopefully at the expense of the nobility. But this nobility was growing ever more powerful, and even though this equated to some kind of stratification within the same aristocracy, it was normally still noblemen, especially also the impoverished ones. We have seen it in that video about the 14th century French army organization that made the bulk of the men-at-arms. that were the backbone of any army in Europe at the time. So when you look again at the 100 Years' War, consider that the guys from the other side of the French were still noblemen. Those who made the thing, right? Not the longbowmen that were just a support. So you don't have to cure a failure of the nobility. You have, if anything, especially in the case of France, a crisis stemming from the fact that France had boomed in the 13th century, and now with the crisis of the 14th required a state that had historically not existed yet, right? The Capetians had already done a lot, right, to fix, let's say, to govern, but it had been a very kind of contingent process. And so the 100 Years' War shows how France could live this moment of crisis, could be less politically cohesive, even though she had top military qualities, she could not make all the pieces work adequately. Yet they win the war in the end, which is also yet another thing. If they sucked so much, why did they win in the end? It's just that the battle is impressive, is spectacular, it's great. I must say, before last autumn, I had never studied the Battle of Poitiers. It's one of the single most beautiful battles that I've ever reconstructed. It's a masterpiece there. The Black Prince, made his, the grade, and it was the highest point of his career. But it has hardly anything to do with missile forces, per se, right? It's always combined arms, and still the missile forces are the inferior one compared to the heavy ones, right? So these are very different times from the times in which the vassalic cavalry, according to feudal norms, was provided by the vassus in the form of military auxilium to his senior, etc. For only 40 years of service, 40 days, of service a year, right? That were always surpassed with extra pay, practically, and that's how also mercenaries had come about. Very often were the same knights, right? It is true that many fief holders, especially in England, prefer to pay a substitutive tax, such as the scutage, rather than providing with an armed service, because naturally this, they had other stuff to think about. War was a risk. Life was already short and brutal enough at the time. These men were rich. They wanted to make business. They didn't want to go at war. And the sovereigns were okay, because by a degree they could simply use the scutage money to hire other troops, including other noblemen, instead were always there, plenty of kind of wanting to go at war. At least especially the most impoverished ones could also be, promoted further in the social ladder like that. You see that the mercenaries were required, famously, I made multiple videos about this, in starting from the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, by the Italian communal cities, the most important of which were carrying out militarily, with an enormous effort, by the way, and success, the passage from a city to a regional state, and whose ruling establishments loved the golden spurs and blackish furs. Considered, however, war as also a bigger, business they had to carry out, not just in the individual heroic fashion that now had definitely made its time, but that still employed massive amounts of men-at-arms, fighting mostly on horseback, as look at the German mercenaries. And we're talking about some of the largest armies in Europe, 5,000, 6,000 men-at-arms, in service of seigneuries like the Milanese one, the Scaliger one. And so actually a powerful coming back also of a lot of cavalry power in a moment in which the mid-14th century crisis had made declining also there what had been the largest number of infantry ever fielded, with also probably the highest quality of infantry there ever fielded in Europe so far. So this aspect should be appreciated also through another consideration that we can't do now because I quit now, but on the fact that the demographic and economical crisis had created essentially smaller and more versatile mercenary armies. What does this mean? It means that among the various things, literally the battlefields became smaller again, or at least the degree of fortification now was more effective than before. Like if you are habituated to operate with armies of 30,000 men, you can overrun many fortifications just by appearing, right? Now, if you operate with just maybe, again, an unprecedented number of cavalry, but almost just that, 5,000, 6,000 men at arms, you can still be stopped, also because this is a huge concentration of horses, of men. It logistically, it's terrifying. It has a massive specific weight. And so you can bog these forces down more easily, right? So that's, for example, like the condottieri warfare has been mistaken on the legacy of Machiavelli as an allegedly bloodless thing, because the entire rhythm of warfare by the late Middle Ages had slowed down in the first place. They were the same places, even more fortified, more statalized, that had smaller armies. It's obvious that these armies would be kind of more technically refined in a way, but even though still, and so more actually based on the hardness of the individual soldier. To say even, look at infantrymen, they have increased the amount of their equipment. They are heavier, they're better armored. Yeah, okay, but 50 years before, for that infantrymen, there were other 5, and they weren't that worse equipped than them, and their armies made much bigger things. Instead, we have exchanged the if you want, the lamer part of the late Middle Ages, that again has dramatically smaller armies than what existed before in the Middle Ages, in the first part of the late Middle Ages. For, oh my God, the infantry took off. It's an incredible thing, whatever. The concept is being resized dramatically after the disgraceful, the idea of the military revolution that sounds literally as bad as it is. That made us believe that at some point armies explode. Not even Renaissance armies sometimes were as large as the ones of the full medieval civilization. And they were different. They were heavier, they had more artillery, no doubt. There was more punching power, there was more. But generally speaking, combined arms were dramatically more advanced in the past. And there was also a relative, difference in punching power because, technology still progressed very slowly, right? This is more or less the picture here, and I've been composing it quite patiently, trying to take my time for these videos and being exhaustive and looking at all the various perspectives and sedimenting them as chapters so that we can also talk from a better standpoint next time about related topics and further on the same treated here. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.